When he posed straightforward inquiries to her, she found herself unable to provide straightforward responses. That was the precise moment everyone realized the hearing chamber carried the distinct scent of floor wax and political aspiration. It always smelled that way, as the Russell Senate office building had been marinating in those essences since 1909. No quantity of remodeling could ever successfully wash away either of those lingering odors. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana showed up 20 minutes ahead of schedule, which was a rarity for a gentleman who enjoyed making a grand entrance. He was dressed in a navy suit, selected by his spouse, wire-framed spectacles that gave him the appearance of a provincial librarian, and footwear that required a shine. He held a single file folder, one so slender it bent in his grip, and he placed it on the table much like a man might discard a church program. He did this nonchalantly, acting as though the folder held nothing of any real importance inside. The Senate Judiciary Committee's session regarding federal fraud within government-funded initiatives was intended to be standard oversight work. It was the sort of event C-SPAN aired to vacant living rooms while the rest of America was busy eating supper. However, the list of witnesses had been revealed 2 days prior, and once journalists spotted Representative Ilhan Omar's name beside the scheduled testimony, the hearing transformed into Washington's most sought-after event. Omar made her entrance precisely at 10 o'clock a.m., accompanied by 2 lawyers from a prominent lobbying firm and a squad of aides clutching binders thick enough to halt bullets. She was clad in a deep purple hijab and a fitted blazer, with her chin elevated at the specific angle she utilized for television cameras. She had dedicated 3 full days to getting ready for this specific occasion. Her team had conducted practice hearings, anticipating every assault, every implication, and every racial signal a Republican senator might possibly use. She was prepared. The spectator gallery was filled to capacity, with Omar's backers having arrived before the sun came up. There were young progressives in T-shirts defending her, women wearing hijabs in support, and a group from Kentucky sporting identical lanyards. The section reserved for the press offered only standing room, with MSNBC sending a producer and CNN deploying 2 separate camera teams. Stories were already queued up on their laptops, awaiting the instant Omar would take apart whatever political theater the Republicans had organized. Omar sat down at the witness table and gave a cool nod to Kennedy, who was already positioned opposite her. She had anticipated open hostility, but what she received was significantly worse. Kennedy offered a smile, yet it was not the political grin that officials rehearse in front of restroom mirrors. It was the genuine, crinkle-eyed smile of a grandfather who was truly happy to see you. "Representative Omar," he said in that syrupy Louisiana accent, the one that made every phrase sound like a front porch story accompanied by sweet tea. "Thank you for agreeing to our invitation. I want you to understand, before we begin, that I value your presence here today. Some people in your situation would have declined, so it takes bravery to show up." Omar's primary lawyer moved slightly in his seat. Praise from John Kennedy was akin to a calm bayou surface, looking peaceful on top but concealing dangerous creatures beneath. "And I wish to state something else," Kennedy went on while fixing his glasses. "Your personal history is truly extraordinary. I mean that sincerely, as you arrived in this nation from a refugee camp in Kenya. You were a young girl who had lost her mother, escaped a civil war, lived years in a camp, and eventually became a congresswoman." He hesitated, and that silence felt authentic. "That represents the American dream. That is the tale my father would have shared at dinner, saying, 'That is why this nation is exceptional.'" A handful of Omar's fans in the audience nodded in agreement. This was not the offensive they had been expecting, so perhaps the old man was losing his edge. Omar permitted herself a tiny, guarded smile. "Thank you, Senator. I value those remarks." "I meant every single one of them," Kennedy replied. Then he donned his reading spectacles, opened the slender folder with the same nonchalance he used to place it down, and gazed at the lone page within. "Now, ma'am, I merely have a couple of basic inquiries, nothing complex. I am a simple fellow from a simple state, and I prefer simple responses." He peered over the top of his frames. "I am just attempting to comprehend some figures that do not seem to calculate correctly." The camera captured a flicker in Omar's eyes, a micro-expression lasting a fraction of a second that revealed everything. She realized in that instant what anyone who had observed Kennedy manage a hearing room already understood. Simplicity coming from this specific senator was the deadliest weapon in all of Washington. "Certainly," Omar replied with a steady voice. "I am glad to answer any queries." Kennedy grinned once more. "Very well then," he said. "Let us begin with something straightforward." Kennedy glanced down at his single piece of paper and then back up at Omar with a look of amicable confusion. It was the look of a man who had discovered a raccoon in his trash bin and was honestly baffled about how it arrived there. "Ma'am, I have been reviewing your financial disclosures, the documents you filed with the House clerk under penalty of perjury." He allowed that final phrase to drift softly through the chamber. "In 2023, you declared assets of roughly $250,000. Does that sound accurate?" "That is roughly correct," Omar stated, "and student loan debt, plus some credit card debt. You mentioned being a working mother trying to make ends meet in two costly cities, Minneapolis and Washington. I realize that the cost of living is difficult everywhere." Omar nodded, feeling she was on safe terrain by appearing relatable and human. "But then I examined your 2024 disclosure," Kennedy continued, while maintaining that baffled look. "And ma'am, I must say I assumed there was a typographical error because, according to your filing, your assets leaped to somewhere between $6 and $30 million. He looked up, emphasizing that this happened in one single year. The figure hung in the atmosphere like thick cigar smoke. Therefore, I put my glasses on to read it a second time, and it was not a mistake. Kennedy scratched the back of his head. A motion so rustic it could have been accompanied by a banjo tune. "Now, ma'am, I served as state treasurer of Louisiana for 21 years. I have viewed many financial statements, watching them rise and fall. However, I have never in my whole career witnessed anyone go from $250,000 to $30 million in 12 months. He paused, and when he spoke again, his drawl slowed to the speed of molasses. "Where I am from, we refer to that as either a miracle or something requiring a great deal of explaining. Since you do not seem to have discovered the Ark of the Covenant, I am hoping for the explanation." Sporadic laughter rippled through the audience, and even a few of Omar's supporters smiled. Kennedy's wit worked that way, disarming you right before the knife appeared. "My husband's business endeavors saw significant growth," Omar said, delivering her practiced answer smoothly. "He manages Rose Lake Capital, a venture capital firm, and E Street Crew, a winery in California. Business valuations can oscillate substantially." "They certainly can," Kennedy concurred in a friendly manner. "So let us discuss those specific businesses." He consulted his sheet of paper with just one glance, as quick as a hummingbird. "Rose Lake Capital, your husband's venture firm, was involved in some court proceedings in 2024. Discovery documents were submitted, and according to those records," he read slowly, "Rose Lake Capital held $42.44 in its bank account." He looked up, repeating $42.44. The audience stirred, and the winery E Street crew possessed 5 cents. A nickel. Kennedy held up his hand, with his thumb and forefinger nearly touching. I could not purchase a piece of gum with the contents of those accounts. He placed the paper down. Now you are telling this committee that a firm with $42 in the bank is worth between $5 and $25 million. Ma'am, that is comparable to me claiming my neighbor's dog is worth a luxury car because it might win a race someday. The math simply does not function. More laughter erupted, louder this time, but beneath the mirth, something was changing. The journalists had ceased smiling and were now writing furiously. Omar's composure remained intact, but her lead attorney was already leaning in to whisper something. She waved him away. Business valuations are founded on projected future earnings, intellectual property, and deal pipelines. Senator, not merely bank balances. I am certain the Treasurer of Louisiana comprehends that concept. Oh, I do, Kennedy replied pleasantly. I also comprehend that when a company's account lacks the funds for a fast food meal, yet claims a value of $25 million, someone is either a genius or a liar. He raised a hand swiftly. Now, I am not stating which one, I am just noting those are the 2 possibilities. He shifted forward a bit. But here is what truly baffles me, ma'am. In February 2025, you told a business publication, and I am quoting, that you are not a millionaire, but a working mom with student debt. That statement was made after you filed the disclosure indicating up to $30 million in assets. He pulled his glasses down his nose to look at her over the rims. So which is the truth? Are you a working mother with loans, or are you worth $30 million? You told the public one thing while telling the government something very different under penalty of perjury. Omar's jaw tensed. My husband's assets are listed on my disclosure as required by House rules. That does not imply they are my personal funds. Ma'am, Kennedy interrupted softly. When you file a financial form stating $30 million and then tell a reporter you are not a millionaire, one of those declarations is false. I cannot tell you which one, but I can count to $30 million, and I can calculate student debt. Those 2 figures do not reside in the same neighborhood. The progressive section of the audience had fallen silent. It was not a hostile silence, but the sort where people begin listening rather than cheering. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, which groaned as if it held opinions of its own. Now those are just the numbers. And numbers are cold things. They lack feelings, religion, or politics. They simply exist. He closed the folder and would not open it again for the remainder of the hearing. Let us discuss where some of those figures might have originated. Shall we talk about the Meals Act? Kennedy took a sip of water from a paper cup. It was the type of small human action that made people forget they were observing a Senate hearing. Instead, they felt like they were in a living room hearing a sharp elder tell a story that would end somewhere tragic. In 2020, he started, you sponsored the Meals Act. The concept was to simplify feeding hungry children during the pandemic. Schools were shut down, and kids relying on school lunches were going without food. It was a real and serious problem, and your bill was intended to assist. He nodded almost to himself. I voted for comparable programs because nobody wants children to starve. That is not a Republican or Democrat stance. It is a human being stance. Omar sat up straighter in her seat. This was territory she had prepared for. The Meals Act broadened access to federal nutrition programs at a time when millions of children needed it. I know what it did on paper, Kennedy said. Let me describe what it did in practice. His voice lost exactly 1 degree of warmth. Just 1 degree. But in the quiet room, everyone sensed the temperature shift. $250 million was stolen. $250 million was not lost to bureaucratic waste or eaten by overhead, but stolen by criminals exploiting the program your bill established. He let the numbers settle. Now, here is how it functioned for the folks watching at home who are unfamiliar with this scandal. People in Minnesota established daycare centers on paper. These centers claimed to feed hundreds of children daily. The federal government, utilizing the framework your bill expanded, sent money to pay for those meals. Kennedy's drawl deepened, as it always did when he was about to deliver the devastating part. However, there was a problem. Those daycare centers were not feeding anybody. Some of them did not have any children at all. Reporters discovered buildings with locked doors and dark windows that were billing the government for thousands of meals a day. They used shell companies, fake invoices, fake attendance sheets, and fake everything. He looked at Omar. 78 people have been indicted and 57 convicted. These were not masterminds, ma'am. Some of them attempted to bribe a juror with a bag of cash, which is not organized crime, but brazen theft by people who thought nobody was looking. Kennedy's voice dropped. But you know who I keep thinking about. Not the criminals, but the children. The room shifted, as something in Kennedy's tone had changed from prosecutor to preacher. There is a 7-year-old girl in Cedar Riverside, whose name I do not know, but she exists. She was supposed to receive lunch through this program. Her mother works 2 jobs, and school was closed due to the pandemic. The government promised that girl a meal, and your bill was supposed to deliver it. He paused. However, the money meant to buy that little girl's lunch went into a shell company in Minneapolis. From there it went into a wire transfer, and from there it bought a luxury car for a man who has never fed a hungry child in his life. 2 women in the gallery, Omar's supporters wearing shirts defending her, looked down at their laps. That little girl went hungry, ma'am. Not because the government did not care or because there was insufficient money. She went hungry because the funds were stolen through a program you sponsored. Omar found her voice, and it carried the edge of someone who had practiced this response. Senator, I was one of the first members of Congress to call for an investigation into this fraud. I sent a letter to the Secretary of Agriculture. When? Kennedy asked. Excuse me, when did you send that letter? Before or after the journalist exposed the fraud? Silence followed. Because I have the letter, ma'am, and it is dated after the story broke. Not before, not during, but after the cameras were already rolling and indictments were coming. He scratched his chin. Now, maybe that is a coincidence. Maybe you were writing that letter at the same time reporters were publishing their stories. But here is what bothers me. He counted on his fingers the way a man might count items at a store. 1, the program your bill created was exploited for $250 million. 2, the majority of the convicted fraudsters are from your district in Minnesota. 3, some of those fraudsters donated to your campaign. You returned those donations after they were caught, not before. He held up a 4th finger. And 4, in the same period this fraud was exploding, your family's net worth jumped from $250,000 to $30 million. He looked at her with an expression that had shed the last of its warmth. Now I am not accusing you of anything, ma'am. I want to be very clear about that. I am asking questions because that is my job. So far, you have not given me a single answer that makes the math work. Omar's lead attorney leaned forward. Senator, you are drawing connections that do not exist. Representative Omar had no knowledge of or involvement in this. Counselor, I am talking to the representative. Kennedy said, not unkindly. She is a grown woman who can speak for herself. He turned back to Omar. Unless you would rather have your lawyer answer for you. Omar's eyes flashed. I can answer for myself. Then answer this. 250 million was stolen from a program you sponsored. Your net worth jumps 30 million in a year. You returned campaign donations from convicted fraudsters, but only after they were convicted. Do those numbers not bother you? I find it deeply offensive that you would imply this. Ma'am, the only thing I am implying is that $250 million was stolen from hungry children. If that does not bother you, we have bigger problems than your financial disclosure. The room had gone church quiet. It was the kind of quiet where you can hear a photographer's shutter from 50 feet away. Kennedy reached for his water cup again. But money is money, so let us talk about something more personal. He took a sip. Let us talk about Mr. Tim Minett. Kennedy set down his paper cup and folded his hands on the table. The gesture made him look like a Sunday school teacher about to discuss a particularly uncomfortable parable. Ma'am, your campaign paid approximately nearly $3 million to a company called E Street Group. Is that correct? My campaign used the group for legitimate consulting services, Omar said carefully. Digital advertising, fundraising, and mail production. Nearly $3 million worth, Kennedy repeated. Now E Street Group is owned by Mr. Tim Minett, who is currently your husband. But at the time those payments began, he was married to someone else, a woman named Beth Minett. Omar's attorneys were already moving, with pens scratching and heads leaning together. And during the time your campaign was paying his company millions of dollars, you were having a romantic relationship with Mr. Minett. Kennedy didn't phrase it as a question because he didn't need to. His wife at the time found out, and she filed for divorce. He pulled a single sheet from inside his suit jacket. It was not from the folder, but from his jacket, as if he'd been carrying it close to his heart. Now, I normally wouldn't read someone's divorce filing in a public hearing. That is private pain, and I respect private pain. But Mrs. Beth Minett's words were given under oath in a court of law, and they directly involved the use of campaign funds. So I hope you will forgive me. He read slowly, not for dramatic effect, but the way you read something that deserves to be heard by every person in the room. Mrs. Minett stated under oath in her divorce deposition that her husband told her in April 2019 he was having an affair with Congresswoman Omar. He said he had been traveling with her on campaign trips that she believed were personal in nature. When I asked how they could afford all this travel, he said not to worry, because Ilhan's campaign is covering everything. Kennedy set the paper down. Ilhan's campaign is covering everything. The gallery was motionless now. The campaign is not a magic fund, ma'am. Campaign money comes from donors, real working people in Minneapolis who gave $20 or $50 because they believed in you. A grandmother on a fixed income, a young man saving for college, or a single dad who skipped his coffee for a week so he could contribute. His drawl deepened. Those people didn't donate to fund anyone's love life. They donated because they thought their money was going to democracy. Instead, it went to hotel suites and romantic dinners, and travel for two to places where no campaign events were scheduled. Omar's face had hardened into the expression she wore on cable news, defiant and controlled. Those were legitimate campaign expenditures that were properly reported. Were they? Kennedy leaned forward. Because the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board found that you used over $3,000 in campaign funds for personal travel. They also found you used campaign funds to pay for personal tax preparation, specifically to correct those joint tax returns you filed with a man you weren't married to. We will get to that in a moment. He held up a finger. But my personal favorite, and I use that word loosely, is this. You used campaign funds to pay your divorce attorney. You were divorcing Mr. Elmy so you could marry Mr. Minett, whose company you were paying nearly $3 million in campaign funds. Kennedy sat back and looked at the ceiling as if performing complex arithmetic in his head. So let me see if I have got this right. Campaign donors gave you money, and you used that money to pay a man you were sleeping with. Then you used more of that money to divorce your husband. Then you married the man you were paying, and then you kept paying him. He looked at Omar. Ma'am, where I come from, that is not a political campaign. That is a business plan. The sound that came from the gallery was not laughter. It was the sharp intake of breath from people who had just heard something they could not unhear. One of Omar's staffers in the back row put her face in her hands. Kennedy was not done. But here is what really gets me. After all of this became public, the affair, the payments, and the divorce, you cut ties with the E Street Group. You said it was to avoid the appearance of impropriety. But by then, the company had already received nearly $3 million. He rubbed his temples. That is like robbing a bank, returning the bag, and saying you want to avoid the appearance of bank robbery when the money is already gone. Omar turned to her attorneys for a whispered and urgent conference. The lead attorney straightened his tie, a nervous habit, and nodded. Senator, Omar said, her voice tight, I have addressed these campaign finance matters extensively. I have cooperated with every inquiry, and I find it deeply troubling that you are using a woman's divorce, a painful, personal matter, as political theater. Kennedy nodded slowly. Ma'am, I agree with you that divorce is painful, which is why I feel for Mrs. Beth Meint. She didn't ask for any of this. She didn't run for Congress, and she didn't sponsor any bills. She was a wife who found out her husband was having an affair with a congresswoman, and that the congresswoman's campaign was footing the bill. He looked directly at Omar. You want to talk about painful personal matters? Mrs. Minot had her marriage destroyed, and had to learn that it was funded by campaign donors. Where is your sympathy for her? Omar opened her mouth, closed it, and opened it again. Nothing came out. Kennedy let the silence breathe, then spoke quietly. Now, I promised I would ask simple questions, so here is the simplest one yet. He removed his glasses and set them carefully on the table. When he spoke again, his drawl was still there, but something underneath it had turned to steel. Can you tell this committee under oath who Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi is to you? The hearing room had changed. Not physically, as the marble columns and brass fixtures remained, but the air had changed. The energy that Omar's supporters had brought into the room. The defiance and solidarity had evaporated like dew on hot pavement. Kennedy sat perfectly still. Without his glasses, his face looked different, sharper. The folksy grandfather had packed up and gone home. What remained was a man who had graduated magna cum laude from Oxford. He had spent 2 decades counting every dollar in Louisiana's treasury. He had not asked a single question today that he didn't already know the answer to. Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi, Kennedy repeated. You legally married him in 2009 in Hennepin County, Minnesota, as the marriage certificate is on file. Is he your brother? The question landed like a stone in still water. Omar's lead attorney was on his feet before she could respond. Senator, this line of questioning is based on thoroughly debunked conspiracy theories rooted in Islamophobia and xenophobia. Counselor, Kennedy said, I asked a yes or no question. I didn't ask for a press release. He turned back to Omar. Ma'am, I am going to ask you one more time, and I would appreciate a direct answer. Is Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi your biological brother, yes or no? Omar straightened in her chair. Her voice carried the practiced steel of a woman who had answered this question 100 times on cable news. No, he is not my brother. That allegation is a baseless racist conspiracy theory that has been debunked. Thank you, Kennedy said. He is not your brother, and you have said so under oath, so that is on the record. Now, since he is not your brother, and since this is a conspiracy theory that you say has caused you great personal pain for nearly a decade, why not end it today? Omar's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? A DNA test, Kennedy said simply. Quick, painless, one swab, and results in a week. If he is not your brother, the test proves it. Conspiracy theory dead, buried, and nobody can ever bring it up again. You win forever. The room held its breath. I will not submit to a degrading request, she began. The Daily Mail asked you in 2019, Kennedy continued as if she hadn't spoken. You refused. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune asked, and you refused. Fox News refused. Congressional investigators refused. Tom Homan announced his office is looking into it, and now I am asking you under oath in front of the American people. He spread his hands on the table. If this man is not your brother, one cotton swab makes every question I am asking right now disappear. It vindicates you completely and permanently. So I ask again with genuine respect, why won't you do it? Omar's attorneys were in full conference mode, with whispers flying back and forth like sparrows in a barn. Omar sat rigid, her jaw working, her eyes locked on Kennedy with an intensity that could have melted the Senate seal off the wall behind him. She said nothing. Kennedy let the silence last 5 seconds, 10, then 15. The silence was louder than anything either of them had said all morning. I will take that as a continued refusal, Kennedy said quietly. And the American people can decide for themselves what that refusal means. He shifted gears, not abruptly, as Kennedy never did anything abruptly. He moved with the smooth, unhurried certainty of a man steering a boat through familiar channels. Let us talk about what we do know, facts and records, with no conspiracy theories needed. He looked at his single sheet of paper, which by now felt less like a document and more like a loaded weapon. While you were legally married to Mr. Elmi, you filed joint federal tax returns with Mr. Ahmed Hirsi in 2014 and 2015. Is that correct? Omar's lead attorney started to object. Ma'am? Kennedy looked past the attorney directly at Omar. Did you file joint tax returns with Mr. Hirsi while legally married to Mr. Elmi? A long pause followed. On the advice of counsel, I decline to answer. The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board already answered this question for you, Kennedy said. In their investigation, they confirmed that you filed joint returns with Hirsi while legally married to Elmi. That is not a conspiracy theory, ma'am. That is your signature on a federal tax return. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. Now I am not a tax lawyer. I am just a country senator from Louisiana. But even I know that filing a joint tax return with someone who is not your legal spouse is a federal offense. It violates 26 U.S. Code Section 7206 regarding willfully filing a fraudulent return. That carries up to 3 years in federal prison and a heavy fine. He let the statute citation hang in the air. And there is something else that puzzles me. In 2017, when you filed for divorce from Mr. Elmi, you submitted an application for service by alternate means. In that document, you stated under oath that you had no contact with Mr. Elmi since June 2011. Kennedy looked up. But in 2015, you posted photographs on your Instagram account of a trip to London. In those photographs, you are standing next to Mr. Elmi. He let the contradiction speak for itself. So you told a Minnesota court you hadn't seen this man since 2011, but in 2015 you were posting pictures with him in London. Ma'am, Those two things cannot both be true. One of them is perjury. Omar's second attorney, the one who hadn't spoken all morning, pulled out a legal pad. He began writing what was either a very important note or a very urgent resignation letter. Kennedy leaned back, and the chair creaked, that same sympathetic creak. "Ma'am, I have been asking questions in Senate hearing rooms for 8 years now. Before that, I spent 21 years in Louisiana state government. I have questioned hundreds of witnesses, maybe thousands. Good people, bad people, confused people, and scared people." His voice softened to something almost tender. "And I have learned one thing that has never failed me. Innocent people answer questions. They answer quickly, clearly, and completely, because the truth is easy. It doesn't require preparation, lawyers, refusing DNA tests, or invoking the Fifth Amendment. It doesn't require posting Instagram photos that contradict court filings." He looked at Omar. "Innocent people have nothing to hide, while guilty people have nothing to say." The gallery was silent. It was not the charged silence of anticipation, but the hollow silence of people watching something collapse. "But we have one more subject to cover," Kennedy said. "And this one isn't about money, marriages, or tax returns." His voice changed. The drawl didn't disappear, as it couldn't any more than the Mississippi River could stop flowing south. But something beneath it shifted like bedrock moving. "This one is about nearly 3,000 Americans who went to work one morning and never came home." Kennedy removed his glasses from the table and placed them in his jacket pocket. He wouldn't need them for this. He didn't need a sheet of paper or notes. What he was about to say had been living inside him for years, and it didn't require a script. The room felt it. Every person in that gallery felt the atmospheric pressure drop the way animals feel a storm before it arrives. Kennedy had spent 5 chapters being funny. He had made the gallery laugh and made even Omar's supporters smile. The humor had been his instrument, his tool, and his weapon of choice. He put it down now. What replaced it was something the hearing room had not yet seen from the senior senator from Louisiana. It was uncut moral conviction. "In 2019, Kennedy began, and his voice was different, lower and slower. "You spoke at a fundraiser for the Council on American Islamic Relations, and you said the following words." He didn't read them. He recited them from memory, the way a man might recite a wound. CAIR was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something. He stopped. He looked at the table for a moment, then back up. Some people did something. The words fell like stones into a well, and the well had no bottom. On September 11, 2001, 19 terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes. They flew 2 of them into the World Trade Center in New York City and 1 into the Pentagon. The passengers of the 4th were ordinary Americans, ma'am, not politicians or celebrities. Ordinary people fought back, and that plane crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Kennedy's voice didn't rise because it didn't need to. Nearly 3,000 people were murdered that day. Murdered, ma'am. Not casualties of something, but murdered. Firefighters ran into buildings that were burning and collapsing, knowing they would not come out. They ran in anyway, and 343 of them died. Paramedics, police officers, and Port Authority workers were people whose job it was to save strangers. They did it, and they died doing it. He paused. The gallery was absolutely motionless. A woman in the 3rd row was crying silently. People jumped from the 80th floor rather than burn alive. Jumped, ma'am, from a quarter mile in the sky, because that was better than the alternative. Wives called their husbands from inside those buildings to say goodbye. Husbands called their wives. A flight attendant named Betty called American Airlines from seat 3R of Flight 11. She calmly reported the hijacking while the plane was being flown into the North Tower. She was 45 years old. Kennedy looked at Omar. "And you called it something done by some people?" Omar opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy raised one hand. Not sharply or angrily, just a slow, deliberate lift of the palm that said, "Not yet. I have defended publicly on this floor your right to criticize Israel. Policy disagreements are American, and disagreeing with a foreign government's actions is American. I have never and will never say that criticizing Israel makes someone an anti-Semite." His voice hardened. "But that is not what you do, ma'am." In 2019, you said support for Israel was all about the Benjamin's baby. You reduced the Jewish people's deepest geopolitical cause to a bribe. You were forced to apologize by your own party. He counted. In 2021, you compared the United States and Israel to Hamas and the Taliban. Your own Democratic colleagues issued a statement condemning you. Another finger went up. In 2023, your own party voted to remove you from the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Not because of policy differences, but because of a pattern of rhetoric that your own colleagues found indefensible. Another finger rose. In 2024, you visited Columbia University and called Jewish students pro-genocide students. Ma'am, young people exercising their right to disagree with you were labeled pro-genocide. He set his hand down. That is not criticism of Israel. That is a pattern, and patterns have names. Kennedy's drawl, which had faded during this passage like color draining from a photograph, returned now. But it returned, changed, weighted, carrying something heavy. I represent Louisiana, and you know what my people do. They fish, they farm, they build ships, and they cook the best food in America. They don't charge you $40 for it. They go to church on Sunday and they coach Little League on Saturday. They don't have venture capital firms. They don't have winery valuations that jump from a nickel to $5 million. His voice cracked. Not much. Barely a fracture in the foundation. But in the absolute silence of the hearing room, everyone heard it. But they pay taxes, and their taxes fund federal nutrition programs. Programs that under your bill were looted for $250 million. Their taxes pay your congressional salary of $174,000 a year, while you minimize the worst attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. Their taxes support the system that gave you, a refugee from Somalia, the opportunity to become a United States Congresswoman. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't even raising his voice. But every word carried the weight of a man who had spent 40 years listening to people from Shreveport and Baton Rouge and Lake Charles. He had heard their frustrations and their hopes and their anger. He was speaking for them now in the only room that mattered. My people deserve better than this. Your people, the people of Minnesota's 5th District, deserve better than this. All Americans deserve better than this. The woman in the third row was still crying, but she wasn't the only one anymore. Kennedy looked at Omar for a long time. She stared back. For the first time all day, there was no defiance in her eyes. There was no anger and no rehearsed response. Just the hollow expression of a woman who had come to this hearing expecting to fight a political battle. Instead, she had been confronted with something she had no weapon against. The truth delivered without malice, without theater, without anything but the plain grief of a man who loved his country. I have one final question, ma'am, Kennedy said. Kennedy stood up. He had been seated for the entire hearing through 5 chapters of questions, through humor and evidence and the slow accumulation of damage. His standing now carried the force of punctuation, a period at the end of a very long sentence. "Representative Omar," he said, and his use of her title was deliberate. Not hostile or mocking, but precise. A reminder that titles carry obligations. "You came to the United States as a refugee. You were a child. Your mother had passed away and your family fled a civil war. You spent years in a camp in Kenya, waiting for a country to take you in." He paused. "And America took you in." The room was still. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. This country gave you asylum, gave you safety, gave you an education, and gave you citizenship. It gave you the right to vote and the right to speak freely and practice your faith. And then, this is the part that amazes me. This country gave you the right to run for office to represent the very people who welcomed you. Kennedy's voice carried something rare for a politician. Wonder, genuine wonder at the thing he was describing. You became a state legislator, then a United States Congresswoman. A refugee from a camp in Kenya became a member of the United States House of Representatives. Ma'am, there is no other country on earth where that story is possible, not one. He looked at her. So my final question is this. It is not a trick question, and it is not a legal question. It is the question that every taxpayer in this country has the right to ask. He spoke slowly, each word carrying its full weight. What have you done with that gift? The question floated across the hearing room like a hymn in an empty church. You sponsored a bill that was exploited to steal $250 million from hungry children. Your net worth jumped from nothing to $30 million in a year. You can't explain how you used campaign money donated by working people to fund your personal life. You funded your divorce and your boyfriend's company. You filed false tax returns. You refused to answer basic questions about your marriage history. You called the murder of nearly 3,000 Americans something. You have spread hatred against Jewish people so consistently that your own party removed you from a committee. He let the list settle. America gave you everything, ma'am. Everything. The question isn't what America owes you. The question is what you owe America. Based on what I have seen today, the answer is an apology, an explanation, and about $250 million. Omar's last defense was the only one she had left. She leaned into the microphone. Her voice shook, not with weakness, but with the particular fury of a person who had run out of arguments. Senator Kennedy, what you have done today is an act of racism. You have targeted me because I am a black Muslim immigrant woman. Every question you have asked has been designed not to seek truth, but to dehumanize me. This is exactly the kind of hatred I face. Ma'am, Kennedy said, and his voice was so quiet, the microphone barely caught it. I haven't mentioned your race, I haven't mentioned your religion, and I haven't mentioned your gender. Not once. I have talked about money, tax returns, campaign funds, a bill that led to massive fraud, and your own words about 9/11. He stepped away from the table. You keep telling America that anyone who questions you is a racist. But you cannot answer the questions. At some point, today specifically, the American people are going to notice something. Every time you are asked a question you don't like, you call the questioner a bigot. That is not a defense, ma'am. That is a confession that you don't have one. The silence that followed was the kind that ends careers. At that moment, the committee chairman cleared his throat and read a statement into the record. The Department of Justice and the House Ethics Committee had opened formal inquiries into Representative Omar's financial disclosures. The Treasury Department's investigation into potential links between fraud funds and foreign entities would be expanded. A separate review of the Meals Act oversight failures was being referred to the Inspector General. Omar's attorneys gathered their binders. Her staffers, who had arrived that morning with righteous energy, were already filing out with heads down. One by one, the signs defending her disappeared from the gallery, folded and tucked into bags like flags after a surrender. A Democratic colleague, a member of the committee who had sat silently through the entire hearing, leaned into his microphone. "I want to note for the record," he said carefully. His voice carried the unmistakable cadence of a man building distance between himself and a sinking ship. Oversight and accountability are bipartisan values, and every American, regardless of party, deserves honest representation. He didn't look at Omar when he said it, because he didn't need to. Kennedy gathered his folder, still thin and still containing only one sheet of paper. He slipped it into his jacket, as he hadn't opened it since Chapter 2. He hadn't needed to. Every devastating revelation had come from public records, published reports, and Omar's own words. The folder was almost irrelevant. The weapon had never been the documents. The weapon had been the questions. He nodded to the chairman, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the exit. But he stopped just for a moment, just long enough to turn back to Omar, who sat alone. She was at the witness table with attorneys packing, staffers gone, and supporters vanished. "Ma'am, where I come from in Louisiana, we have a saying, 'Don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining.'" He adjusted his glasses. "For 7 years you've been telling America it's raining. Today the sun came out." He turned and walked through the door. The cameras followed him as cameras do. They follow the person who still has power, not the one who just lost it. Behind him, Ilhan Omar sat at the witness table. The microphone in front of her was still on with the red light still glowing, but she had nothing left to say into it. The room emptied around her like water draining from a sink. When it was done, she was alone with the marble columns. She was alone with the brass fixtures and the portraits of dead senators who stared down from the walls. If you caught them at the right angle, they looked an awful lot like judgment. The hearing ended at 3:22 p.m. Eastern Time. By 3:30, the clip of Kennedy's line had been viewed 6 million times. By 4 o'clock, it was 12 million. By the time most Americans sat down for dinner, the number had lost all meaning. It was everywhere, on every platform, in every language. It was a sentence that captured in 14 words what the entire hearing had taken 4 hours to prove. The networks split along predictable lines. Fox News led with "Kennedy dismantles Omar in historic hearing." CNN ran with "Contentious Senate hearing raises serious questions about Omar's finances." MSNBC spent an uncomfortable 40 minutes trying to frame it as a Republican attack on a woman of color. Then a panelist, a former federal prosecutor, quietly noted that the financial discrepancies Kennedy identified were in fact legitimate subjects of inquiry. The panel moved on quickly. Omar's team released a statement at 6:15 p.m. through her communications director. It was 4 paragraphs of boilerplate racist attacks, Islamophobic targeting, and manufactured controversy. The statement was notable for what it did not contain. It contained no answers. Not one of Kennedy's questions was addressed. Not the net worth discrepancy, the valuation, the campaign payments, or the tax filings. The absence of answers was by that point the only answer that mattered. Within 48 hours, 3 developments reshaped the landscape. First, the House Ethics Committee announced it would conduct a formal review of Omar's financial disclosures. This was a rare step that required bipartisan agreement. Second, the Department of Justice confirmed through a spokesperson that financial matters related to Representative Omar were under active review. Third and most devastating, two progressive organizations that had publicly defended Omar for years issued statements. They expressed concern about the financial discrepancies and called for full transparency. In Washington, concern is the word allies use right before they become former allies. The Minnesota Star-Tribune published a front-page investigation 3 days after the hearing. They traced the timeline of Rose Lake Capital's valuation from $42 to $25 million. The article, which ran to 4,000 words, concluded with a quote from a forensic accountant. In 30 years of examining financial statements, I have never seen a valuation increase of this magnitude without a clear documentable event. None of those events appear to exist here. Omar's response was to call the investigation part of a coordinated right-wing campaign. The Star-Tribune, which had endorsed her in 3 consecutive elections, did not respond. The Feeding Our Future case continued its slow, grinding progress through the federal courts. The conviction count climbed past 60. Sentencing hearings produced testimony from program administrators who described in meticulous detail how shell companies had been created. They explained how fake invoices had been generated and how millions of dollars had been wired to accounts overseas. In one particularly damning hearing, a cooperating witness testified that the fraud had been easy. It was so lacking in oversight that participants had joked about it. We called it free money, the witness said, because nobody was checking and nobody cared. Kennedy took no victory lap. He gave just one interview to a local Baton Rouge station that had been covering Louisiana politics since before he was born. The interview was conducted on the porch of his home in Madisonville. He sat in a wicker chair that had seen better decades, wearing khakis and a polo shirt. He looked less like a United States senator than like a man who was about to go fishing. "I don't enjoy that sort of thing," he said when asked about the hearing. "Some folks think I do because they see the jokes and think it is entertainment. It is not entertainment. It is frustration. When you see public servants betraying the public trust, and nobody asks the obvious questions, the frustration has to go somewhere. For me, it comes out as humor, but underneath the humor, I promise you, there is nothing funny about any of it." The interviewer asked about Omar's accusation that the hearing was racially motivated. Kennedy looked out at the lake, where a pelican was diving for fish about 50 yards from shore. It was graceful from a distance, but chaotic up close. "I have been called a lot of things in my career," he said. "Racist isn't one that sticks because my record speaks for itself. I have fought for flood insurance reform for communities that are majority black and majority poor. I have secured federal money for hospitals in parishes where the nearest emergency room is an hour away. I have never in my entire life made a decision based on the color of someone's skin." He looked back at the camera. "I asked questions about money, tax returns, campaign finance, and words she said about 9/11. If asking those questions makes me a racist, then the word racist doesn't mean anything anymore. That is dangerous because when you use that word to deflect every question, you cheapen it for the people who actually experience racism. I mean real racism, the kind that isn't about Senate hearings, but about getting followed in a store." He paused. "I respect Representative Omar's right to defend herself, but calling your questioner a bigot is not a defense. It is an admission that you don't have one." The interviewer asked what was next. Kennedy reached down and picked up a glass of sweet tea that had been sweating on the porch railing. He took a sip and set it back down. "That is up to the Department of Justice and the Ethics Committee. That is up to the people of Minnesota, who are going to have to decide if they want a representative who can't answer simple questions about where her money comes from." He smiled, not the devastating smile from the hearing room, but the quieter one. It was the one he wore when he wasn't performing for cameras, but just being John Kennedy from Centerville. He was just a man who ended up in Louisiana and somehow ended up in Washington and still couldn't quite believe either one. My job was to ask the questions, and I asked them. What happens next is above my pay grade. The interview ended, and the Baton Rouge station aired it at 6:00 p.m. It was picked up nationally by morning. Kennedy spent the rest of the evening on his porch watching the sun go down over Lake Pontchartrain. The water was flat and gold and endless, the way it always was at dusk. The pelicans were still diving, and somewhere across the lake, the lights of New Orleans were beginning to flicker on. He had asked simple questions in a simple drawl, and the answers, or the absence of them, had done more damage than 1,000 pages of evidence ever could. Because the truth, as Kennedy had always known, doesn't need a thick file. It just needs someone willing to ask for it out loud. The sun set, and the pelicans flew home, while somewhere in Minneapolis, Ilhan Omar was learning a lesson. She was finally understanding what the people of Louisiana had known about John Kennedy for years. The gentleman always gets you with the question you can't answer, and by the time you realize it, the whole world is listening.